You probably don't recognise this man, but he's one of the most powerful men in British media. Sir Paul Marshall is a hedge fund manager reportedly worth £630 million, and he's the owner of news website Unheard and the co-owner of GB News. He owns 42% of the station. He was also one of its key initial investors. He now wants to buy the Spectator and the Telegraph, which would give him just enormous control over the conservative media in this country. But Paul Marshall appears to have some rather unsavoury views. A Hope Not Hate investigation has found some rather shocking content on Marshall's private and anonymous Twitter account. Among tweets liked by Marshall are this. So you can see, UK has lost its identity. These people did not come to assimilate into European culture. They came to conquer and replace British people. Allah wants this, sort of the great replacement theory. They've come here to conquer and replace British people. He's also like this one. It is just a matter of time before civil war starts in Europe. The native European population is losing patience with fake refugee invaders. So talking about a civil war, so it's very sort of violent imagery that this sort of conjures up. And then here, if we want European civilization to survive, we need to not just close the borders, but start mass expulsions immediately. We don't stand a chance unless we start that process very soon. So these are all the very sort of extreme tweets that have been liked by this man. He also retweeted this, very extreme. So this is Carl Benjamin, so Sargon of Akkad, he sort of said basically, and then shared this quote, Pascal's wager in the 21st century. God may or may not be real, but the other side is so passionate, so committed to worshipping Satan, evil, homosexuality, and corrupting children that even if God wasn't real, believing in him to fend these demons off is preferable. So fairly scary stuff. These are some very extreme views being promoted by one of the most powerful media moguls in Britain. And by chance, I happen to have been booked to appear on GB News the day after Paul Marshall's Twitter activity had been revealed. I was on to talk about Suella Braverman's fear-mongering article about Islamist extremism taking over Britain, but I couldn't help but bring up how, when it comes to GB News, the extremism is often coming from inside the house.
She's been banging this drum for months and months and months, and it's why she was sacked.
Sure, so and I think it's a very bad drum to be banging, right? I have a problem with Islamist extremism. I also have a problem with far-right extremism, right? And
90% of suspects on the terror watch list in this country are Islamist extremists.
So 2 MPs have been killed in the past decade, one by a far-right extremist, one by an Islamist extremist. Now, as you've sort of recognised there, I think one problem with Islamist extremism is it has led to more acts of terrorism. My problem with far-right extremism is it has way more access to power. And I have to say, GB News, I think, is an example of this. So there was an exclusive yesterday, actually from Hope Not Hate, sort of showing what tweets
that was a load of
your owner had liked and retweeted. I think it probably is worth reading them out.
Half those tweets, the majority of normal thinking people in this country
agree with. Let's test it. Let's see what the audience do.
Can I say something? Hope Not Hate as well. They call themselves an anti-extremist organisation. They are some of the most extreme far-left agitators and campaigners.
Let's read the tweets. Let's read the tweets. So these are the ones that your co-owner liked. It is just a matter of time before civil war starts in Europe. The native European population is losing patience with fake refugee invaders. Now, I'm against violent extremism, warning about a civil war. 7.5% of the British public are Muslims. You know, the vast majority of them, taxpayers, decent people. And he's liking a tweet about a civil war.
Well, yeah,
We've got another one here.
Talking, he liked to tweet. These are not tweets that he has written.
Pattern. I'll just read one more. Okay. If we want European civilization to survive, we need to not just close the borders, but start mass expulsions immediately. We don't stand a chance unless we start that process very soon.
Do you know what that tweet, Michael, do you know what that tweet was in response to? By the way, so Paul Marshall didn't write that. He just retweeted someone else.
This one he retweeted.
And do you know what that tweet was in response to? Do you know?
It was in response to a video of some people in Africa.
It was Ross Kemp interviewing people in Calais who didn't understand the concept of rape. He was trying to ask them, what happens if you rape a woman?
And do you think that's an argument for mass expulsions of people who are already in this country?
Of rapists, yes.
There aren't enough rapists to have mass expulsions of rapists.
He
is talking about people's ethnic backgrounds.
That tweet from a figure on the centre-right was referring to Islamic rapists.
One more tweet. So this is one he did retweet. Pascal's wager in the 21st century. God may or may not be real, but the other side is so passionate, so committed to worshipping Satan, evil, homosexuality, and corrupting children, that even if God wasn't real, believing in him to fend these demons off is preferable. Now, as a homosexual, I find that somewhat offensive.
Well,
so I think if we are talking about extremism in this country, yes, there are some extremist radical Muslims,
are not here
Islamists,
to actually defend
but there is also
themselves.
a channel which is funded by someone who clearly has very extremist beliefs.
I do like in a debate when you get to say, let me just read these words to you. Let me just read these words to you. It's sort of a good way of sort of slowing down the pace and feeling like you can sort of assert some control in the room. I mean, what was, I suppose, helpful for me is sort of Ben Leo saying, this is completely normal. The majority of the majority of things which are like normal people in this country will agree with. Now, normal people in this country don't all think that we need to find God so that we can defeat Satanist homosexuals. Right, which appears to be the implication of one of these tweets, which was retweeted by, well, essentially, he's not directly their boss, he's not their line manager, but he owns 42% of the channel, so he's going to be very influential in terms of what airs. Let's see what happened next.
Clearly has very extremist beliefs.
Are not actually here to defend themselves. There is a statement which we will bring people. Hope, not hate.
I'll read that statement now. So Paul Marshall.
That statement, Ben.
He said in January 2024. Sorry, no, there we go. That's 1 second.
It's a very divisive ideology, which he seems to be endorsing here, and which is so often propounded from this TV station, right?
He seems to be endorsing it. He did not write those tweets themselves. He does have a reply to all this as well.
So his reply is to say that it's, there's lots of stuff on Twitter. It's a small proportion of what he's been tweeting. Hope Not Hate actually said it's not that small a proportion of what he's been tweeting. And I think it's also, you've got to look here. If this was isolated,
is he not entitled to an opinion, though? This is what we exist for, to have a broad range of opinion and to not shut people down.
Yeah, so we are having a conversation here about extremism, right? And I think one always implicit in a conversation about extremism is there is some sort of limit. So you're talking about people who are talking about radical violent Islamism. They should go on the PREVENT program, right? I also think that people who think there's going to be some civil war between a small ethnic minority and, here it's talking about the native population, that to me is violent extremism or something that
let me just read.
Violent extremism.
Now, that was a really interesting part of this debate, right? Because, if you find, someone has said something very objectionable, they say, well, they have the right to express that opinion, right? Well, the reason we were having that debate in the first place, right, we were debating the article by Suella Braverman where she's sort of complaining about people saying from the river to the sea in the streets, right? And they're agreeing with it. They think it's disgraceful that from the river to the sea was plastered on the Houses of Commons because they say that's an incredibly anti-Semitic thing to say. Now, obviously, as we've said over and over and over again on this show, that's not remotely anti-Semitic. To say what you want is a one-state solution in Israel-Palestine where everyone gets a vote. It's no longer an ethno-state. That is not in any way or form anti-Semitic. But if you're going to say we need to clamp down on people saying that in the street, and then in the next sentence you're going to say it's fine for an owner of a major media corporation to be sort of liking and retweeting and essentially promoting the idea that we should start mass expulsions immediately, though there's going to be a civil war between Muslims and everyone else, or that we need to find God to defeat the homosexuals, right? You can't say, from the river to the sea, that's beyond the pale, but these are all perfectly legitimate. Now, I know you're gagging to hear Sir Paul's response, so let's look at the rest of the debate.
So let me just read Sir Paul's statement. He said, Paul Marshall's account is private, but is nonetheless followed by 5,000 people, including many journalists. He posts on a wide variety of subjects, and those cited represent a small and unrepresentative sample of over 5,000 posts. This sample does not represent Sir Paul Marshall's views. As most X/Twitter users know, it can be a fountain of ideas, but some of it is uncertain quality, and all his posts have now been deleted to avoid any further misunderstanding.
I suppose the issue of representativeness as well. So there are, 7.5% of Britain are Muslims. There is a very, very small minority of those who are violent Islamists. And then how much time is spent in papers such as The Telegraph, which, by the way, he wants to buy, on channels such as GB News, talking about this apparent threat of violent Islamist extremism?
There's plenty of time spent on other papers telling the opposite side of this.
No one's defending Islamist extremism, are they?
So somebody else will write the opposite in The Guardian.
Oh, well, I don't think anyone is in The Guardian saying violent radical Islamism
write the opposite to what she's
is the best
saying.
thing. Right, the opposite to what Suella Braverman is saying?
Yes.
Well, the opposite being that we're not heading towards some kind of civil war. They're entitled to their opinion.
You don't have to agree with it. We can discuss it.
They're entitled to their opinion, but I think what we're talking about here is extreme views in society, which are somewhat undermining social cohesion.
Are you saying there's not a problem in this country?
Well, I think there is. I think there are some radical Islamists in this country.
7-7, Lee
and that
Rigby,
is a
Sir David
problem.
Amos, Mike Freer.
I think the idea that
Arena
I think the idea. So
London
I think the
Bridge
idea.
2017,
Right.
London Bridge 2019, Westminster 2017, Westminster 2020, the Reading attack, Batley Grammar, weekly Hamas sympathetic marches through London, from the river to the sea on Big Ben.
So there are two issues.
People are concerned
There are
about the
two
way
issues
this
which need
country
to be
is heading.
separated. There's two issues that need to be separated. So ISIS-style radical terrorism, right? Obviously, absolutely appalling. We need to make sure that the police are clamping down properly on that. The other issue is that there are a lot of Muslims in this country, lots of them very angry about a war going on in Gaza, which I think is perfectly legitimate, who are being smeared as on the same spectrum as the kind of people who carried out the 7-7 bombing. Now, I don't try and say that everyone who voted Brexit, everyone who wants to stop immigration is, of the same type of person as the person who killed Joe Cox, right? So I think we have to be very careful about generalisation. Obviously, violent extremism, a massive problem, but trying to lump a whole ethnic minority in with a tiny minority of violent extremists, I think is very, very dangerous.
Okay, Michael, we're going to have to leave it there and breathe.
Nice debate, lively.
And breathe. So you saw him then lump in from the river to the sea, projected onto the House of Parliament with 7-7, like a terrorist attack that killed, shed loads of people, right? The conflation is just completely bizarre. I do think that on the left, there can be a tendency to do a similar maneuver, which is to sort of say anyone who wants to reduce immigration, anyone blah, 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 they are essentially the same as a far-right terrorist. It's just this slippery slope. The far-right terrorism is sort of just the real face of the conservative politician. And I also think that that's important to resist. It's important to say it's perfectly fine to fundamentally disagree, but we need to demarcate disagreement from violent extremism. And that's something that, GB News are intentionally failing to do there when it comes to pro-Palestine protesters. And I would say that these tweets, which have been liked and retweeted by the owner of GB News, or the co-owner of GB News, I think they fall into that category of, extremism. He would argue all this. It's not saying we should have a civil war, but is it just a matter of time before civil war starts in Europe? The native European population is losing patience with fake refugee invaders. Now, this is a tweet, again, he's liked it. He hasn't written it himself. But to me, that conjures up lots of violent imagery, right? That doesn't seem to me a sentiment which is opposed to violent extremism.